deal here. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I don't think we need to have the opening prayer since we just got done with prayer meeting. So we'll just get right into our class. We're studying Daniel. We saw his now probably forever. If you didn't know it beforehand, you'll remember that's Daniel chapter 3. Okay, then Daniel chapter 4 was Nebuchadnezzar's grace and saving salvation. 5 was the fifth cycle of discipline. This is where we get the writing on the wall and the fact that the reign of Nebuchadnezzar's heirs ended, and we ended up coming in with the Persian and the Median rulers. And we saw in point 6 a summary of lessons from chapter 5. Chapter 7 is where we are right now. We're in Daniel in the lion's den. Chapter 6, excuse me, point 7, Daniel in the lion's den. We saw Babylon both in scripture and in history, and the fact that Babylon fell. Faithfulness is promoted. We saw Darius reorganize the empire, and faithfulness is promoted. Daniel is put into a very high place. Remember, he was one of the three governors, if you will, or not governors, but one of the three individuals over the various governors, also called satraps. He had 40 satraps that were underneath him, and each of the satraps had a particular region of the empire that they ruled. Then we saw jealousy. The king, Darius at the time, had been put in place. Cyrus put Darius in place. Darius was very fond of Daniel and was looking to make him even more, promote him even more. And you had jealousy strike, and the individuals then went ahead and got the king to make an edict that anybody that prayed in the certain 30-day period to anybody other than the king had to be killed. Okay, but Daniel still remained prayed. Remember, he could have rationalized and said, oh gee, they're going to kill me if I do this, so I'll just pretend that I'm not doing it, but I'll find some way to do it, or I'll wait until the end of the 30 days and then I'll do it, or whatever. But he didn't. He functioned properly. In point H, I talked a little bit about how we can apply that in our lives. I, Daniel, continued to pray. J, we saw Daniel's mental attitude. And in Daniel's mental attitude, we had 6 points. We saw he committed his to the Lord. I gave you a passage, Psalm 55:22. He was occupied with the Lord by drawing from the divine viewpoint in his soul. Psalm 37:4 and 5. He accepted the plot against his life as a test from the Lord, and he countered it with the knowledge. Isaiah 28:9. He thanked God for the crisis and was prepared to do God's will. 1 Samuel 3:18. He remained calm and undisturbed by worry as he placed his confidence in the Lord. Proverbs 3:5 and 6. He didn't lose heart. In other words, he didn't have a mental panic, but continued in perfect peace. Isaiah 26:34. And finally, Daniel was victorious in his faith rest life, secure in the knowledge of God's infinite power. And we have Psalm 57:3. I will cry to God Most High, to God who accomplishes all things for me. He will send from heaven and deliver me. He reproaches him who tramples upon me. God will send forth his loving kindness and his truth. Okay? Subpoint K, Daniel could not expect any protection from the king. Once the king made the edict, unfortunately, even the king was locked into having to fulfill that edict. If someone prayed, which Daniel was caught praying, they were supposed to go and be executed. He couldn't bring back, he couldn't countermand his own order. Okay? And so we had some subpoints under there. L, Daniel's obedience and following the mandates of his God. Publicized, and the rulers were certain that Daniel would not miss even one prayer session. Of course, they had spies out there, and the spies saw him and accused him. We see that that Darius is a weak leader, okay, by the way he acted. He should have acted in a much smarter fashion, something similar to what Nebuchadnezzar had done in the past. Subpoint N, the true purpose of legislation. And I went into the true purpose of legislation and also related it to our own legislation. And so we saw in subpoint 1, says, this concept of a nation was formulated by God as a divine institution for the protection and perpetuation of the human race. Under the principle of the national entity, legislation should protect the people of the nation. However, not all government structures or the laws they promulgate are compatible with this principle. And so the ridiculous law Darius signed demonstrated the fact that it doesn't work. And I brought it to our modern day case with our current immigration policy. Our safeguard the life, liberty, privacy, property, and volition of individuals within a national entity. Legislation should allow freedom in matters of religion, legitimate business, and social life. If any of those are hammered, we understand that you aren't doing proper legislation. Subpoint 3, no human government can rectify all social evils or moral ills, especially not through the pseudo-security of socialism that promotes economic and political doctrines divorced from establishment principles. Curtailing individual freedom for a misguided collectivism will bring divine discipline to a nation as private abuse of freedom. And that's the last point that we had. We're ready to pick up with point 4. So subpoint 4 with 2 parens around it. Daniel was aware that God alone sustained the Persian Empire, and not Cyrus or Darius. See, God had a reason for the Jews in Persia or in this area, and Daniel knew that God was going to protect them. God controls, Lord Jesus Christ controls human history. So he knew that the Persian Empire was being sustained not by Darius or Cyrus, but by God himself, okay? Continue the point. By following God's commands, Daniel was both faithful to the Lord and loyal to the empire, period. By following God's commands, Daniel was both faithful to the Lord and loyal to the empire. See, he was being accused of being disloyal, but he was probably the most loyal of all of them by following God's commands. That's how you function, keeping a empire going, keeping a nation going, is by following God's laws of divine establishment and following God's laws. Continue the point. True patriotism exists in unbelievers as well as believers, comma. So you can't get big heads and say, oh, we're great Christians and we're the only patriots. That's not true. True patriotism actually exists in unbelievers as well. So we have true patriotism exists in unbelievers as well as believers, comma. But mature believers in a national entity are the, quote, salt, end quote, which preserves that nation. Matthew 5:13 So I've had pastors who talk about believers being the salt of the earth. We're the seasoning. We're what makes life interesting. We're the ones that help other unbelievers become believers, and so we're what makes life worth living, and dot dot dot. Like salt as a seasoning, but it's not that concept. In the ancient world, salt was used primarily as a preservative. You didn't have refrigerators like we have. And so what did you do? You dried things out. You put it in brine. You salted it. In fact, salt was so important that that's where our word salary comes from. Sal for salt. They paid people in salt. It was that valuable. Okay? Which, by the way, just to help you out, that's why going to work is called going to the salt mines. Okay, I don't know if you've heard that term, but I'm going to go to the salt mine, right? That's going to work because they got paid in salt. Okay, continue the point. Believers who use doctrine not only ensure national survival, but national blessing as well. On the flip side, Hosea 4, 1 through 6 states that a nation whose inhabitants reject doctrine, okay, Hosea 4, 1 through 6 states that a nation whose inhabitants reject doctrine will ultimately be destroyed. See, a nation exists to provide the capability of its inhabitants to use volition to accept the gospel. That's why you have the primary reason of a nation is to protect the individuals, protect its citizenry, so that they can come to the point of God consciousness and then come to the point of hearing the gospel and accepting it. Okay? And when a nation no longer allows the freedom to do that and has gotten so awful that even if you're at the heart or the center of the nation or whatever, you could never hear the gospel, then that nation has no reason for existing anymore, and it falls. Okay? So mature believers are the salt. Okay? Subpoint 5. In the end, Darius realizes too late that he's been duped and that there's nothing he can do to save Daniel. When a crisis occurs, particularly one of our own making, hindsight usually reveals our shortcomings. So when a crisis occurs, particularly one of our own making, hindsight usually reveals our shortcomings. You ever heard the phrase, hindsight's 20/20? Okay. That means you got perfect vision in the stuff that happened in the past, and you got the idea that I shouldn't have done that. But the Bible tells us don't dwell on that. Don't look at that. Don't live your life in the past. Rebound it and start moving forward. You can't dwell on what you can't change. Okay? So tragically, continuing the point, tragically, we're often blind to the consequences of our actions, until we're snared, until we're ensnared. E-N-S-N-A-R-E-D. Then we bear intense pain and learn the hard way. Just as in Daniel's time, the lust pattern of the old sin nature is still the source of self-deception. Romans 7, 13 through 17. See, we have a lot of Christian activity today that's rampant with good works and activism which aren't motivated or empowered by God the Holy Spirit. Okay, they're empowered instead by human energy and lust for activism. I told you about getting phone calls, right? You know, during the election season where certain churches wanted us to do certain things. It's like, those aren't proper things to do. We don't find power in numbers. How about instead of all this phone calling, you go and you tell people to pray? You put effort in prayer. Prayer is where we get our power. We don't get our power because we have combined our forces with other Christians. We get our power through God. How do we get that power through God? We get that power through God by making our desires known through prayer and allowing God to act. Right? And in this case, Darius should have told his advisors who were telling him and spying on David that they should mind their own business. This is an empire that believes in personal freedom, and he has the power, he has the freedom to pray to whomever he wants to pray to. But his lust pattern, his desire for approbation, allowed him to say, oh yeah, if they don't pray to me in the next 30 days, they ought to be killed, right? So we need to, the idea here, the reason I'm going into this detail, the idea here is that for us, we're to learn that we need to understand where our lust patterns are and not allow ourselves to get tricked and then fall into these things where we end up going, oh, coulda, woulda, shoulda. You need to operate on doctrine. Okay? Subpoint 6. Darius finally grasped the situation and attempted to rectify his error in judgment. You know, the conspirators, on the other hand, they didn't show any signs of remorse. And what's going to happen to them is they're going to reap what they've sown. If you read the chapter, and hopefully you have, or if you're going to, you're not just relying on me to feed it to you. But the idea is when you read the chapter, what you find out is that after all is said and done, these conspirators and their families ended up getting thrown in the lion's den. We'll get there. Okay? So finally, he understands that he's been duped. Okay? Continue the point. Darius immediately, quote, set his mind on delivering Daniel, period, end quote. Previously, he was occupied with his own exalted position, semicolon. But now he would become involved in an intense effort to reprieve Daniel. However, with all his human power and resources, he could find no legal means to rescind the edict. If he had contemplated the ramifications of his decree, before signing it into law, so if he had contemplated the ramifications of his decree before signing it into law, then these personal and national crises would have been precluded. That's why I get frustrated sometimes, every time an election comes around in Arizona, I get frustrated and have to really rebound quite a bit and put a lot of stuff in God's hands in prayer. But primarily with the idea of the propositions. Many of the individuals who vote, who move to this state and vote, don't understand that if a proposition is put in place, our legislature cannot remove it. There is nothing our legislature can do to get rid of it. So these aren't things like, oh yeah, let's try this for a little while, and if it doesn't work, we'll get rid of it. No, it becomes permanent. The only thing that can get rid of it is if it's unconstitutional, either federally or at the state level. And so people just look at these propositions and they vote yes or no half the time on the little bitty paragraph that's on the ballot, which doesn't tell you what a yes or a no really means. They won't take the time to read what the proposition says and read what the implication is. And so, like Darius's edicts, we get these edicts that are ridiculous. Okay? So the idea is you need to read these things. Anyway, if he had contemplated the ramifications of the decree before signing into law, the personal and national crises would have been precluded. Continue the point. How often do we not think our actions through? We must use the doctrine in our souls along with the logic we received through grace to think out our actions and not allow Satan to trick us into arrogant or evil actions. Subpoint 7. As the sun set, on the day Daniel was discovered praying, the conspirators assembled to prod the king into action. They reiterated to Darius his only option. No changes could be made, and Daniel must die. Subpoint 8. Aside, colon. Authority of a supreme decree was one of the built-in strengths of the Persian Empire. Colon. A system of government whereby the monarch was subject to the same law as his people. See, normally this principle was an excellent safeguard to justice. If the king knew that he had to obey the same law as the people, he would be careful with the laws that he put in place. See, our government was designed to be that way, but it isn't that way anymore. How many times have we seen where Congress will pass a law and exclude themselves from the law? If you recall, when we had the Obama health care issue, they came out with Obamacare, congressmen and their families were not subject to it. Anybody that filled out taxes during that time period, and still now, and anybody that filled out taxes after the Obama law went into place, the Obamacare law went into place, you had to sign a statement on your taxes that said that you had health care, right? And if you didn't, you had to go to the government website and get it under punishment of law, unless of course you were a congressman or a senator, because they excluded themselves. They write tax laws that exclude themselves, right? You ever heard of franking? Franking is a privilege where a congressman or a senator can send mail without using a stamp. Now, it doesn't make that much difference in our day of internet and email and all that stuff, but back in the day, right, all they had to do was sign their name in the corner of the envelope and they got to send their mail. They didn't have to pay for stamps like the rest of us. Well, that's because they have to send out so many letters to their constituents and blah, 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 blah. How about instead of sending letters, you got back to where you came from and you met with your constituents? How about that? But anyway, the idea that the Persians had was a good system of government whereby the monarch was subject to the same law as his people. Subpoint A. They have single parents around it. The same concept of, quote, higher law, end quote, originally applied to the United States. Our Constitution was based on the tenets of Bible doctrine, written by a group of men who understood the laws of divine establishment. Now, they weren't all believers, I don't think. You had believers and unbelievers in the constitutional framers, but the idea was they certainly understood the laws of divine establishment, such as freedom, the right to have privacy, the right to property, the right to speech, all of the things that are in our Constitution. Continue the point. Since that time, many laws have been passed which are outside the framework of divine law. Clearly, the influx of socialistic doctrines into American thinking so clearly the influx of socialistic doctrines into American thinking has eroded personal freedom, comma, destroyed incentive, comma, and resulted in the decay of the free enterprise system. Period. See, our nation was founded on the laws of divine establishment, founded on a free enterprise system, okay, founded on capitalism. But we've allowed socialism and social benefits to erode our freedoms. And I've talked about that in the past with something as easy as, I ride a motorcycle laws. I always bring that one up, right? Because it's easy to understand. In a free society, you have the right to go without a helmet, okay? But if you get in an accident and you have a head injury and you're turned into a vegetable, if you will, someone has to be on a ventilator, for the rest of their life, and your insurance can't pay for it because you also decided not to have insurance, boink, they pull the ventilator, pull the plug, they let you die. Right? You suffer the consequences of a stupid decision. That's called freedom. But it's so gross, such gross thinking that socialistic thinking wedges in and says, no, we have the sanctity of human right. We have to protect people. Therefore, we're going to make laws where you have to wear a helmet. And the insurance industry says, yeah, because nobody's being held accountable for their actions and the insurance company's got to pay for it. My sister used to tell me horror stories. She worked in the emergency room of multiple hospitals, and she used to tell me horror stories about things, associated with people that people would come in with, and the hospital couldn't turn them away and would have to pay all of the funds, even knowing that this person had zero money. They couldn't turn them away. Why? Because that's just not the American way. We just don't do those kinds of things. Well, in a free society, you do. When you make dumb decisions, you pay the consequence. Right? I don't want mama governor ruling my state and trying to be my protector. I didn't want to vote in a mother. I wanted to vote in a leader. Okay? But we have this leader who wants to be a mother, wants to mama us. It talks about, it talks to us like we're little children. That erodes our freedom. Subpoint little b, with single parents around it. When there seems to be no recourse, even in the highest court of our land, comma, and I think the Supreme Court has been being seated with people who are more constitutionally oriented. The last couple, not necessarily, but for a while there, we were getting some justices that understood freedom and understood the Constitution. But when I was growing up, we had a judicial system. We had Supreme Court justices who blatantly said, "I don't care what the Constitution says. I am for ... And I'm going to find cases that justify what I feel is the right way to go." Right? During the 60s, that was the big deal. No. The Supreme Court is supposed to uphold the Constitution based on the laws of the divine establishment. Anyway, when there seems to be no recourse, even in the highest court of our land, we must remember that the Supreme Court of heaven is always in session. God will dispense perfect justice in His own time. And in the Old Testament, we see it quite often where you have this injustice that's occurring. And God's perfect justice is to take those individuals who are promulgating the injustice and inflict that same injustice on them. And like I said, what you're going to see is, if you read the chapter, I'm not going to dwell on it, but what happens is these individuals who accuse who accuse Daniel, end up getting pitched into the lion's den themselves. But not only them, their entire family. Why? Why does the Old Testament make a point of taking out the family of the people too? Because of the old sin nature. You remove the head of the household and all the progeny that he has, and you remove that old sin nature. Okay? That's what God did. I don't want this to get any worse. Wonk. I'm going to get rid of all these people. He did it from, the Exodus. Well, he did it from, Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. But the idea was, in the Exodus, how many times did we see, where the ground would open up and would take in hundreds of, of thousands of people and wipe them out? That's why. Okay? Subpoint O. So we go back out to O. We're on N, so we go back to O. Darius had no alternative but to order Daniel's execution. This was to be done by placing Daniel in the lion's den. In the quote, lion's den, period, end quote. Sorry, that's kind of quotes around it. And I've had this picture on the front of our keynote or PowerPoint, whatever you want to call it, because it's one of the best representations. So I'm going to give you a little aside here. I'm going to go too fast for you to write, but just for your own edification, so that you can understand when you're reading this, and you can understand some of the importance of going back to the Hebrew and not relying on the English. I want to go ahead and give you some information here. And so many times The scene of throwing Daniel in the lion's den is pictured with a young, strapping young man. He's like 20. Right? If you go and search for on the web for Daniel in the lion's den, you'll find a lot of pictures where he looks like he's 20, right? And he's being placed in a hole, right? It looks like some kind of a conical hole, right? That they're going to roll a big stone over, okay? But we know that Daniel, even though he was still vigorous, okay, was actually in his early 80s during the events of chapter 6. We've gone through the age of Daniel. So I liked this one because you had a gray-haired man. You didn't have this strapping young man, like a young David going against Goliath, right? You have an old man. He's vigorous, but he's the one that's being put in there. And then the den, like I said, is often thought of as like a hole or a cave or something like that, but it's not. It's actually more like what we consider a cage environment that we've seen at the zoo. Okay, it's not iron bars or anything. It's actually dug in to the ground. Okay, but it wasn't a pit in which the lions were housed in which a person could be thrown, because lions are really good jumpers, right? If you try to stick 20 or so lions in a hole, they're going to end up jumping out. Okay, it doesn't work. And so the following description that I'm going to give you comes from dens as they were found in Morocco and related by a I want to say George, but it doesn't have an E on the end of it. It's Danish. It's Georg, Georg Host, in a book called, or in an article called Fez in Morocco, which was published in 17. Okay, and this comes from page 77 of that work. And it says, while the den was a large carved cavern out of the ground or mountain, it actually had a side opening in which the lion keeper could enter. Okay, so you dig this big hole, or you dig out a part of a mountain, right? But the idea is it's a great big hole, but you also have a side entrance. Okay, so you have a lion. Somebody's got to feed the lions, right? So you have a lion keeper could enter. Okay, then the den itself had two chambers which were separated by partition. So the keeper could throw food into one side, entice the lions to go in there, and then safely enter the other side for the purpose of cleaning it or maintaining it. So if you've ever been to the zoo, you've seen that kind of thing, right? Where they've got the wide open area outside, right? In the back they usually have that's where the cages are and stuff, right? But you entice them out so that you can clean the inside, right? Well, that's it. They had a two-stage pit, if you will. Okay? So they could clean it and otherwise maintain it. And it says the cavern was open above, with a hole being surrounded by a wall of a yard or more high down into the den. So the lions can't jump out of it, right? But you have a big hole there so that people can look down into it. You could throw food down in there, I guess, but you could look down into it. And the mouth of the den that they talk about Daniel being put in the mouth of the den isn't this opening on top, it's the side opening mentioned before, where the lion keeper would go in. So the idea is that they open this without enticing the lion. Well, they entice the lions the other side. They put Daniel in there. They rolled a great big rock in front of it. The king sealed it. Then they pull up the partition and they let the lions go to Daniel. And in the meantime, people could see it. These guys are, ha, 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 he's going to get eaten up. We got to see this, right? That's what they always like to do. Okay, and that explains also the fact that you have this free air being allowed to enter the den, but you have this open top. It explains how, according to the account in chapter 6, the king was able to converse with Daniel before the stone was removed. See, if he's put into a pit or he's put into a cave and a big stone is rolled over it, how in the world does the king talk to Daniel? But the king talks to Daniel before Daniel comes out. Is more like this. So I found this picture and I thought, wow, this person must have really read this account or really understood, because you can kind of see there's a hole on top there, right? For the lions. And you can envision that maybe there's a partition there, where the lions are on this side and they could be on the other side where the bones are, that other corner, right? And placed there, okay? So it explains how, like I said in the biblical account, the king was able to converse with Daniel before the stone was removed. Also, and why I'm telling you this too is because you have people that say the Bible's full of mistakes, and they talk about, well, if there's a stone there, how can the king talk to him? That, see, that's just a story. It's just to make an account. No, it's history. Okay. The description also explains how the accusers, their wives, and their children were placed in the den without them dying prior to being eaten by the lions. In other words, it was a great big pit. How do you put 120 people in, in a pit that's down low, that's deep enough that lions don't jump out, right? Without them getting killed or stomped on each other or whatever, right? You just open up that door, you stick them in there, you close the door, and you pull the partition up, and you let the lions go after them. Now, the traditional English translations confuse the description because they say things such as, quote, cast into the lion's den, okay, with the connotation of being dropped into it. But the Hebrew word means set up or to throw, such as to be pushed. So he was pushed into the lion's den, not thrown. You cast them by pushing them, not picking them up and dropping them down into a pit, okay? And then also, when he's removed, okay, they talk about, pulling him out of the lion's den, but the idea is, the Hebrew word is for mount up, and then it's extended to mean to bring out or to draw out. So he wasn't tied to a rope, and hauled out like we've all seen rescues of people in a mine collapse or in a, some kind of mine shaft or whatever, where they got to drop a rope down there and, someone goes down in a bucket and pulls them back out or whatever. They didn't do that with Daniel. They simply moved the stone and brought him back out, okay? They drew him out. And so we get the idea that, when you read it in English, you get the idea that Daniel was somehow lifted out of the pit using ropes or something, right? That's not the case. So I just want you to notice when you read it, you don't go, wow, how did this happen? That's how it happened. And when people try and say, oh, the Bible's full of all inaccuracies, no. Go back to the historical account. They found lion pits in Morocco that look like this, that were used for this same purpose. So, anyway, he was placed in the lion's den. And you know what? We've got some subpoints under there, but that's where I'm going to go ahead and stop. Okay? So, Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to study in your word and to be able to cycle it